I want you to think back to the last time someone you loved looked you in the eyes and said something that didn't quite add up. You probably told yourself you were overthinking it. You probably smiled and nodded and let it go. I did that for almost 3 years, and the night I finally stopped letting it go, I came home to red and blue lights spinning in my driveway and a police officer holding up his hand telling me I couldn't enter my own house. But I'm getting ahead of myself. My name doesn't matter. What matters is that I was 62 years old, 31 years into a marriage I thought was solid, and I had absolutely no idea what was happening inside the walls of the home I'd spent the better part of my adult life building. My wife and I met when we were both in our early 30s. She was working as a dental hygienist in the same town where I was finishing up a career change into commercial insurance underwriting. We weren't young and reckless when we fell in love. We were deliberate about it. We chose each other the way adults choose things carefully, with full awareness of what we were committing to, or at least I thought we did. We had 2 daughters. Our older daughter was 26 and living in Portland with her fiancé. Our younger daughter had just turned 23 and was finishing a graduate program about 4 hours away. Both of them were good people. Better than either of us deserved, honestly. They'd grown up in a house where their parents didn't yell, didn't throw things, didn't make scenes. We were the couple other people held up as an example. I know that now for exactly what it was worth. The distance between my wife and me didn't happen overnight. It crept in the way cold air creeps under a door so slowly you barely notice until you're already shivering. Looking back, I'd place the beginning somewhere around 3 years before everything fell apart. She started working longer hours. The dental practice she'd joined had taken on new partners and expanded, and I accepted that explanation without question because it was entirely reasonable. She started going to bed earlier. She started answering her phone in the other room. She started responding to my questions with single syllables. I noticed all of it. I want to be honest about that. I wasn't blind. I wasn't some oblivious man walking around with blinders on. I noticed every single thing. I just chose not to examine it too closely because some part of me understood that if I looked hard enough, I would find something I couldn't unknow. And at 60 years old, with a mortgage nearly paid off and grandchildren on the horizon and a life that looked exactly the way I'd planned it, I did not want to unknow anything. So I kept getting up in the morning and making coffee and going to work and coming home and watching the news and going to bed. I told myself we were just in a quiet season. Every long marriage has quiet seasons. That's what I told myself. Then came the Friday in October. My wife came home from work that evening and I could tell immediately that something was wrong. Not wrong the way she'd been for 3 years. That slow, distant, preoccupied wrong. This was a different quality of wrong. She was pale. Her hands were moving when she talked, which she only did when she was anxious. She asked me if I'd eaten, and I said not yet, and she said she wasn't hungry either, and then she stood in the kitchen for a long moment, just looking at the counter. I asked her if everything was okay. She said she needed some space. I said, "Okay. What kind of space do you mean?" She said she needed me to go stay somewhere else for a few days, maybe a week. She needed time to think. She said things had been weighing on her, and she needed the house to herself to sort through her head. I stood there in our kitchen, the kitchen where we'd eaten 10,000 meals together, where we'd argued about small things and laughed about smaller things, and where she'd cried the night her mother died, and I looked at my wife of 31 years and I said, "Okay." I didn't push. I didn't demand an explanation. I didn't ask who she needed to think about or what exactly had been weighing on her. I just said, "Okay." I went upstairs and I packed a bag like she'd asked a reasonable favor, and on my way out, I stopped at the door and I looked back at her and she was already on her phone, not looking at me, and I walked out. I drove to a Holiday Inn about 20 minutes away. I remember sitting on the edge of the bed in that room, with the bag I'd packed sitting on the floor next to me, and I thought, I have been married to this woman for 31 years and I just left my house because she asked me to and I don't even know why. I sat with that thought for a long time. Then I turned on the television and tried to sleep. I didn't sleep well. I lay there watching the ceiling, listening to the highway outside the window, running through conversations in my head. Things I should have said years ago, questions I should have asked. The way she used to reach for my hand in the car without thinking about it, and when that had stopped, and how I'd noticed, but convinced myself it was just because we were comfortable enough that we didn't need that anymore. The lies we tell ourselves to stay comfortable are so much more patient than the truth. At some point past midnight, I did fall asleep. I was deep in that thick, dreamless sleep that only comes after real exhaustion when my phone lit up on the nightstand. It was my younger daughter. I answered on the second ring, already sitting up, because adult children do not call their fathers after midnight with good news. She was crying. Not the soft kind of crying, the kind where you can hear them trying to catch their breath between words. She said, "Daddy, I don't know what's happening." She said, "I've been trying to reach Mom for 2 hours and she's not picking up." She said, "I called the neighbor because I didn't know who else to call, and the neighbor said," and then she stopped, and I heard her exhale, and she said, "Daddy, the neighbor said there are police cars at the house." I was already out of bed. I told her I was on my way. I told her not to call anyone else yet. I told her to stay on the phone with me. I pulled on my shoes and grabbed my keys, and I was in the car in under 3 minutes, driving in the dark on empty roads back toward the house I'd left 8 hours earlier with a bag and no answers. The drive felt both very fast and very long. My daughter stayed on the phone the whole way, and I kept my voice steady for her even though my chest felt like someone was sitting on it. I told her it was probably nothing. I told her there could be a dozen explanations. A break-in, a medical situation, a gas leak, anything. I told her not to assume the worst. I was assuming the worst. I turned onto our street, and I saw the lights before I saw anything else. 2 patrol cars pulled up in front of the house. 1 unmarked sedan parked at the end of the driveway, and along the front porch railing, bright yellow against the dark, crime scene tape. I pulled over and stopped the car and sat there for a moment. I told my daughter I had arrived. I told her I would call her back. I told her I loved her. Then I got out and started walking toward my house. An officer stepped forward before I reached the driveway. He held up one hand and asked me to stop. He asked who I was, and I told him I was the homeowner. I told him I lived there. He asked for my ID, and I gave it to him. And he looked at it and looked at me and then said, "Sir, I'm going to need you to wait right here for a moment." I waited. I watched other officers moving around near the front door. I watched a man in a dark jacket who I would later learn was a detective standing near the porch with a clipboard. I watched an ambulance parked further down the street that I hadn't noticed at first, and I understood then that whatever had happened inside my house was serious. The detective came down the driveway and introduced himself and shook my hand. He said he was sorry to meet me under these circumstances. He said there had been an incident at the residence. He said my wife had been involved and that she was being treated on scene and was conscious and stable. I said, "What kind of incident?" He said there had been a physical altercation. He said another individual had been involved and that individual had sustained injuries and been transported to the hospital. He said there were things he needed to ask me. I said, "I want to call my daughter first." He said, "Of course." I stepped away and called my younger daughter back, and I kept it brief and as calm as I could. I told her mother was okay. I told her I was handling it. I told her to call her sister and to wait and that I would call them both when I knew more. Then I hung up and went back to the detective and I said, "What do you need to know?" I will tell you something about that conversation that took me a long time to understand. I was cooperative. I was polite. I answered every question he asked me honestly, standing in the cold in my hotel clothes in my own driveway while my wife was somewhere inside my house talking to other officers. It wasn't until days later, when I was talking to an attorney, that she sat across from me and said, "You should have had legal representation before you answered a single question." She was right. I was never a suspect in any meaningful sense, but I didn't know that standing in that driveway, I didn't know the shape of what had happened yet. And talking to police without understanding what you're walking into is something I would tell any person in any situation to think very carefully about. What came out over the next several hours, and then over the next several days, was this. My wife had been involved with someone for approximately 2.5 years. A man she'd met through the dental practice, not a coworker, but a vendor, someone who came in quarterly to service equipment. He was 51 years old. He was, I would later learn, not a particularly stable person. The relationship had apparently been intense in the way that relationships built on secrecy and adrenaline can sometimes become intense, urgently emotional, high stakes in ways that had nothing to do with genuine depth. And in the weeks before that Friday, my wife had tried to end it. He had not accepted that. He had started showing up. At the practice, at the grocery store, at places where she'd go, he'd sent messages, he'd called. And that Friday evening, while I was sitting in a Holiday Inn believing my wife simply needed space to think, he had come to the house. My wife told me later that she hadn't planned to see him. She had told him clearly it was over. She said he arrived and forced his way in when she opened the door, and that what followed was an argument that turned into something worse. He grabbed her arm. She told him to leave. He didn't. She managed to get to the phone and call 911. In the process of the struggle, he fell. He fell badly, caught the edge of the coffee table we'd had since our younger daughter was in middle school, and it was serious enough that he needed surgery. He survived. He spent 4 days in the hospital and faced charges that ultimately resolved with a guilty plea. My wife cooperated fully with police and faced no charges herself. The investigation confirmed the account she gave. But here is what doesn't get resolved by a police report or a guilty plea or a cooperating witness. My wife had been living a different life inside our shared life for 2.5 years. She had sat across from me at dinner. She had slept in our bed. She had come with me to our older daughter's engagement party 8 months before, and she had hugged me for the photograph, and she had whispered something in my ear that made me laugh, and I had felt, in that moment, genuinely happy. And none of it had been what I thought it was. The weeks that followed were the strangest of my life. My wife and I stayed in the same house because there didn't seem to be anywhere else to go, but we existed in it like two people occupying the same waiting room. She apologized. She apologized many times, in many ways, with a sincerity that I didn't doubt. Sincerity doesn't change the shape of a thing, though. An honest apology is still just an apology. My daughters came home. My older daughter arrived first, flying in from Portland, and she hugged me for a long time without saying anything, and that helped more than anything else anyone said or did in that entire period. My younger daughter drove down, and she was angrier than her sister. Younger children often carry the family's anger on behalf of everyone. And she sat across from her mother at the kitchen table and asked questions that I couldn't have asked, questions I didn't want to hear the answers to but needed to hear anyway. Her mother answered them, all of them. She didn't deflect or minimize or justify. She answered every question and accepted every response. I will give her that. I had my own questions, though I asked them differently. Over several evenings that winter, my wife and I sat together, not the way you sit with someone you're reconciling with, more the way you sit with someone you're trying to understand, and I asked what I needed to ask. I asked when it started. I asked why. I asked whether she had ever intended to tell me. I asked what she had been feeling when we were at our daughter's engagement party. I asked whether she had ever, at any point, considered what it would mean for the life we had built. She said she had thought about it constantly. She said she had hated herself for it. She said it had started as something she told herself meant nothing and became something she didn't know how to stop. She said she had been ending it for months before she actually ended it. She said she was sorry in a way that went beyond words, and that she understood if that wasn't enough. It wasn't enough. I want to be honest about that too. Genuine remorse doesn't put 3 years back. It doesn't unknow what you now know. It doesn't restore the version of your life you were living before you understood it correctly. We separated officially the following spring. It was not a bitter separation. There was no war over the house or the money. We had attorneys and we sat down like adults and we made decisions with the same deliberateness we'd use to make every major decision in our lives together. The house sold in the summer. She moved into an apartment near the practice. I rented a small place on the other side of town for a while, and then, after about 8 months, I moved to be closer to my older daughter in Portland. Portland was good for me in ways I hadn't expected. I didn't know anyone there. which sounds like it should make things harder and instead made things easier. I wasn't anyone's cautionary tale in Portland. I wasn't the man from the neighborhood whose wife had done what she did. I was just a man in his early 60s who'd made a fresh start, which is a thing Americans fundamentally respect. My older daughter and her husband had their first child, my first grandchild, a girl 14 months after I moved. I was there the day she was born. I held her about an hour after she came into the world, and she looked up at me with that unfocused newborn gaze that sees everything and nothing, and I thought about how much world she was going to live through, how much she couldn't possibly know yet, how everything was still ahead of her, and how that was the most extraordinary thing I had ever held in my hands. There are things I know now that I didn't know at 61, before that Friday in October. I know that ignoring something because examining it is frightening is not the same as trusting someone. I spent years confusing those two things. Real trust isn't looking the other way. Real trust is actually looking and then believing what you see. I know that the things we tell ourselves to stay comfortable have a cost that doesn't show up on the bill until later. I paid it all at once, in one night, in a driveway full of blue and red light. Some people pay it gradually, which might be easier. I'm not sure. I know that 62 is not too old to start something over. I say this not because starting over was wonderful. It wasn't. It was hard and lonely and confusing in ways I didn't have the vocabulary for, but because it was possible. The possibility matters more than the comfort of the thing. I know that my daughters are the best thing I have ever done. Not the marriage, the daughters. I know that the neighbor who called my younger daughter that night an older woman who'd lived 3 houses down since before my daughters were born. That woman sent me a handwritten card about a month after everything happened. She said she was sorry for what I was going through. She said she hoped I knew I was a good man. I've kept that card. I kept it through the move to Portland and through 2 apartment changes since then. I have it in the drawer of the nightstand next to my bed. Some kindnesses are small enough to carry with you. There's one more thing I want to say, and it's the thing that took me the longest to find words for. People ask me, not often, but sometimes, whether I'm angry, whether I hate my ex-wife, whether I want her to suffer. I think they expect the answer to be yes, because that's the answer that makes sense in a tidy story. Betrayal leads to anger, leads to justice or revenge, or at least some satisfying moment where the person who wronged you gets what they deserve. But I'm 64 years old now, and I have a granddaughter who is 10 months old, and I live 10 minutes from my older daughter, and I talk to my younger daughter on the phone most Sundays, and I have a small apartment with a window that faces west, and on clear evenings, the light that comes in during the last hour before dark is something I genuinely look forward to every single day. And somewhere across the country, my ex-wife is living her life and working at her practice and making her choices and carrying whatever she carries. She is not a villain in the story I tell myself about my own life. She made choices that I will never fully understand and that cost both of us more than either of us will ever say out loud. But she is also the woman who sat at a kitchen table and answered our younger daughter's hardest questions without flinching. She is also the woman who told the truth to police on a night when it would have been much easier not to. People are complicated. They are capable of being deeply wrong and genuinely good at the same time. That's the thing they don't tell you about betrayal. The person who hurt you doesn't stop being a full person just because they hurt you. That's not forgiveness exactly, or maybe it is. I'm not sure it matters what you call it. What I know is this. I came home on a night I wasn't supposed to come home, to a life that turned out to be different from what I thought it was, and everything fell apart in the most visible and documented way possible. And here I am, still standing in the kitchen making coffee, still getting up in the morning, still choosing, one day at a time, to face whatever the day actually is, rather than the version of it I'd prefer. If you're somewhere in the middle of something like this, if you're in the part where the lights are still spinning and you don't know what you're walking into, I just want you to know that the other side exists. It looks different than what you had before. Different doesn't mean worse. Sometimes, on a clear evening with the right light coming through the window, different is exactly what you needed all along.